Hi, year 11s and 12s. Today we're going to be looking at carbon cycling. This is the third PowerPoint, and it will only be one video long for this PowerPoint, but it's the third PowerPoint in the ecology topic. There's only 4 PowerPoints, remember, in the entire topic. This is an SL topic for the IB diploma. So the first thing we're going to look at, I won't go through the need to know for this one. If you want to look at the need to know for what's in carbon cycling, you will need to look at that PowerPoint that's on the OneDrive. But in terms of, to start with this, the first thing you need to do is a skill. So one of the need to knows is a skill that you have to be able to construct a diagram of the carbon cycle. Okay, and over here we have a diagram of the carbon cycle. Okay, so this is a good one that you could draw. So essentially, we start off with carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Okay, now carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is taken up through producers, through photosynthesis, and it's turned into glucose. That glucose is transported into animals when they consume the producers, and then when these animals respire, and same with the plants, when they go through aerobic respiration, they return that carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere. And this is one of the things we will talk about. But you see how over here, for example, we've got plants are both taking carbon dioxide from the environment, from the atmosphere, but they're also returning it to the atmosphere. But the equation for photosynthesis just states that carbon dioxide is taken from the atmosphere. The truth of that is it's actually a net summary. So even though we're taking it from the atmosphere and returning some to the atmosphere, we're taking more from the atmosphere than we're returning. So there's a net loss of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere taken up by plants. So plants, photosynthesis, take the carbon dioxide from the air, turn it into glucose. That glucose is transported to animals through consumption, and then they both aerobically respire, returning carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. Now, occasionally, some of that glucose will be used up as some of the carbon dioxide will be used up as different carbon compounds inside the bodies of these organisms, and when they die, it goes through a decomposition and fossilization process to create fossils. And there's carbon stored underground in fossils. We'll talk about that a little bit more depth. But those fossils can then be extracted for fuels because they're turned into oil, coal, and gas. And we burn those in our products such as electricity, cars, etc., which creates pollution, which returns carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. That carbon dioxide in the atmosphere can also be absorbed into the water, making the water acidic, which helps us to create things like limestone and shells. But again, we'll talk about all of these processes in more detail in this PowerPoint. But for now, you have to be able to draw this carbon cycle. So this is the key terms that you'll need: photosynthesis, respiration, feeding, decomposition, fossilization, sedimentation, extraction, and pollution. We will talk about all of these in more detail throughout this PowerPoint, but this is how to draw the carbon cycle itself. So, carbon fixation. Let's start with carbon dioxide being taken up into the plants through trees and plants, etc. Okay, so we know an autotroph, something that creates its own food, will absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and convert it into carbohydrates, lipids, and all other carbon compounds through things like photosynthesis. And when they do that, they're reducing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So something like a plant is actually considered something known as a carbon sink. It's taking in more carbon dioxide than it's releasing, and hence it's taking carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, so it's a carbon sink. Okay. Generally, carbon dioxide concentration in our atmosphere is about 0.039%, but where parts of the Earth's surface where there is more vegetation, more plants, and there's more photosynthesis occurring, we actually have seen lower concentrations of carbon dioxide. So it's one of the reasons we want to actively plant trees, etc., to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and help global warming. Also talking about carbon dioxide diffusing into water or into those autotrophs. So, like we said before, we know autotrophs are using carbon dioxide to produce carbon compounds through photosynthesis. That also happens through chemosynthesis, which we talked about in the first PowerPoint. That reduces the concentration of carbon dioxide in autotrophs. So that while they're taking in the carbon dioxide, they're actually converting it into something else and reducing the concentration of carbon dioxide in the autotrophs. Okay. It also sets up a gradient between the cells in an autotroph and the air around them. Okay, which allows the carbon dioxide to diffuse from the atmosphere into those autotrophs. Because if they just took the carbon dioxide in and then they left them as carbon dioxide, eventually it'd have more carbon dioxide in the plant and cells of the plant, and it wouldn't take any more in. But because it's actively being converted into other carbon compounds through photosynthesis and chemosynthesis, the concentration of carbon dioxide is never too high in the cells. It's always higher in the environment, and constantly the carbon dioxide continues to diffuse into the plant. Terrestrial autotrophs, so autotrophs that are on the ground and on the land, they do this through stomata, which we looked at through the electron microscope a few weeks ago. Whereas aquatic autotrophs will do this through their entire stem or leaves and take the carbon dioxide straight from the water. So we've got how carbon dioxide is being taken in. So if we go back to our carbon cycle, we've got this part all done. We've got this green arrow here. We've got this green arrow here being covered, how carbon dioxide is being taken into plants. Now we want to look at this pinkish arrow, the respiration arrow. So if we go back to this slide that we were just on a second ago, talking about how respiration releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So aerobic respiration, which we have over here, sugars plus oxygen gives us water plus carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is a waste product. Okay, so aerobic respiration, carbon dioxide is a waste product. It's generated, we don't need it, we have to get rid of it. So all cells that carry out aerobic respiration, they're creating this waste product of carbon dioxide. Because we're creating that, there's a higher concentration in the animal or in the organism than in the air, and hence it will diffuse out of the organism into the air. So for us, we do that through our lungs. We're using capillaries and our alveolar sacs, which we'll talk about a little bit more when we get to the anatomy and organisms. But the carbon dioxide will diffuse into the blood, into the lungs, and then the lungs will exhale it out into the atmosphere. Okay, but generally, carbon dioxide, waste product of cellular respiration, we'll talk about a little bit more when we talk about molecular biology, released into the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide in water. So we know that carbon dioxide is soluble in water, but carbon dioxide can either remain in water as a dissolved gas or it can combine with water to form something called carbonic acid. Carbonic acid can then dissociate or break apart to form hydrogen and hydrogen carbonate ions. Okay. When it dissociates and forms those hydrogen carbonate ions and hydrogen, that's how we lower the pH of water. So we're making water more acidic. Okay. Both dissolved carbon dioxide and those hydrogen carbonate ions can be absorbed by aquatic plants or aquatic autotrophs, which they'll then use to make carbohydrates and other carbon compounds. And we're even going to talk about in the next slide how some animals will use this to create limestone and shells. So mollusks will create shells. So that's what we're going to talk about here. So when those hydrogen carbonate ions from the dissociation of carbon dioxide in the water comes into contact with rocks and sediments on the ocean floor, those rocks and sediments acquire metal ions. Okay, that results in the formation of calcium carbonate, and then consequently the development of limestone, which we can see in this picture here. Okay, so that's how limestone is created. Living animals will also use that hydrogen carbonate ions to form calcium carbonate. Okay, calcium carbonate forms the hardened exoskeleton of coral, so that's why coral's hard, as well as creating the shells for mollusks like snails, etc. When those organisms die, those hard calcium carbonate products will fall to the sea floor and may become fossilized in limestone. So we can also see in this limestone, you can see lots of little shells, etc. And that is the mollusk shells, etc. that have been fossilized in the limestone. Okay, so going back to this one here, we've now covered photosynthesis, the green arrow. We've covered the pink respiration arrows, and we've also covered the ocean arrows here to methanogenesis. Okay. All of our organic matter, when it's under anaerobic conditions, can produce methane, which will diffuse into the atmosphere or could also accumulate into the ground. Okay. Methane is produced really widely in any anaerobic environments because it's a waste product of anaerobic respiration. So remember anaerobic respiration, if you don't remember from previous years, that's respiration without oxygen. Okay, so this is the type of energy creation that happens when there's no oxygen available in the environment those organisms live in. There's three types of anaerobic prokaryotic cells that will actually help contribute methane into the environment. So we've got bacteria that will convert organic matter into organic acids, alcohol, hydrogen, and carbon dioxide. They all produce methane. We've got bacteria that use organic acids and alcohol to produce acetates, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen. And then we also have our archaeans, which produce methane from carbon dioxide, hydrogen, and acetate. Okay. Because of that, out of those three, we have archaeans are considered something called methanogenic. Okay, they're creating methane. Methane creation. They will carry out methanogenesis in many different anaerobic environments. So they can create methane in the mud along the shores in the bed of lakes, in swamps, mires, mangroves, and other wetlands where soil is waterlogged so oxygen can't physically get in the guts of termites to help break down the items that termites can't digest, in the digestive tract of ruminant animals. So ruminant animals are things like cows, sheep, and goats, and that's what we've got in this diagram here, as well as landfill sites where organic matter in waste have been buried under the ground and there's limited oxygen. So they're under the conditions where methane will be generated. Then methane, once it's created, moves up into the atmosphere where it will stay there. Those molecules of methane will stay there for approximately 12 years. While it's in that atmosphere, it's stored in the stratosphere where it actually goes through oxidation. But basically because methane is being oxidized in the stratosphere, that's why we have such low levels of methane in the atmosphere itself. But know that when it is up there and it breaks down, it stays there for roughly 12 years. Okay, so going back to our carbon cycle, we're now going to look at this section here, fossilization, and also how we're creating fuels, oils, and gases. Okay, so we're looking at these two here, our purplish, dark purplish arrows here. Okay. So, first off, I'm going to talk about peat. Okay, now peat forms when organic matter is not fully decomposed, so it's partial decomposition, and it's because of the acidic or anaerobic conditions in those waterlogged soils that we talked about previously. Okay, so in most of the soils that we have in the environment, organic matter such as dead leaves from plants will eventually be digested by saprotrophic bacteria and fungi. Now, if we go back to our saprotrophs that we talked about in our first PowerPoint, saprotrophs obtain oxygen they need from air spaces in the soil. Okay. In some environments, because the water physically can't drain out of the soil, the water builds up and it leaves them known as waterlogged. When it's waterlogged, no oxygen is physically in the water. We're getting carbon dioxide buildup. We're starting to get very acidic conditions, and saprotrophs can't thrive under those conditions. They start to die. That leads to further acidic conditions, further inhibiting any saprotrophs that are still around, as well as methanogens, and consequently, all of this aerobic respiration doesn't occur anymore. The breakdown of dead leaves and plants doesn't happen. Okay. By this point, we get large accumulations of decomposed organic matter, partially decomposed because it started to be broken down by the saprotrophs. It wasn't fully broken down. And it becomes compressed, forming a dark brown acidic material, which we call peat. Now, 3% of the Earth's land surface is covered by this substance. Okay. When peat is compressed even further under other sediments, the heat and the pressure of those other sediments force out the impurities as well as the moisture, which allows the peat to undergo a chemical reaction to form coal. Okay, so we've got here 300 to 400 million years ago, we've got some vegetation in marshy areas, and it starts to decompose in the absence of oxygen, forming peat. Okay, 50 to 100 million years ago, we start to get all these layers of other sedimentation on top of the peat, which starts to remove all the impurities. The pressure and the heat start to remove all the impurities, as well as the moisture. And over, when we get to present time, all of a sudden we have coal, basically, which we then come and we dig up that coal, and we use that for our own fuel sources. Okay. Peat is not the only way this happens. This also happens under the water, which is when we're talking about oils and gases. So oils and natural gases are formed at the mud at the bottom of seas. Again, usually anaerobic conditions, so decomposition is usually incomplete. Okay. As more mud starts to deposit, the partially decomposed matter is compressed and heated, like with peat formation. But then we get chemical changes which produce complex mixtures of liquid carbon compounds or gases, which we call crude oils and natural gases. Okay. Again, you can see over here, we've got our aquatic plants and animals die. They're buried under the ocean floor by layers of sand and silt. That's around 300 to 400 million years ago. Then we start to have the layers of sediment deposit above them, and the pressure and heat causes those remains to be compacted. And then eventually, when we get to present time, those remains have become oil and gas, which are forced out through porous rocks when we start to drill through them. Okay. Now, in both these slides, you can see that these are 300 to 400 million years ago, these organisms dying. Okay, and starting to decompose. So this is why they're non-renewable, because renewable resources can be replenished in the one life cycle of a human. This is taking 300 to 400 million years to form these sources of fuel. So consequently, they're non-renewable. Won't ever be renewed in our lifetimes. Okay. Lastly, last couple of slides, we're going to talk about combustion. So carbon dioxide is produced through combustion of biomass and fossilized organic matter. Okay. So if we get organic matter and we heat it to its ignition temperature in the presence of oxygen, it will set light and it will start to burn. Okay. Whenever that starts to happen, that's an oxidization reaction, and we call that combustion. Okay. The product of complete combustion is carbon dioxide and water. Okay. So, for example, when we have periodic fires in forest or grasslands, we release carbon dioxide in the atmosphere from the biomass that's burning. Okay. Coal, oil, and natural gases, they're different types of fossilized organic matter. These were supposed to be released into the atmosphere millions of years ago when they died, but instead they've been stored, and then we burn them once we've extracted them millions of years later as fossil fuels. Okay. At this point, as I just kind of referred to, those carbon atoms and carbon dioxide have been removed by the atmosphere millions of years ago. So they've been taken out of the system, and we're introducing them back at a time that they shouldn't be there, which increases the carbon dioxide concentration of the atmosphere higher than it should be. Now, an alternative to this is fossil fuels. An alternative to fossil fuels is biofuels. For biofuels, how that works is naturally living organisms will form hydrocarbons as part of their biomass, and we can extract those hydrocarbons to produce alternate fuel sources, such as biodiesel. Now, these biofuels can be considered renewable if waste products are removed. If they're not removed, they're not considered renewable. Okay, so we can, instead of using fossil fuels, we can leave that carbon back in the ground or stop releasing extra carbon that we shouldn't have in the atmosphere and just focus on biofuels, which are more environmental. Okay, so carbon fluxes. Carbon fluxes describe basically the exchange of carbon between various carbon sinks. Now, remember we talked about carbon sinks before. Carbon sink is any natural reservoir that can absorb more carbon than it releases, which means in those areas there'll be lower levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We have four main types of carbon sinks. So lithosphere, which is the Earth's crust, the hydrosphere, which is the ocean, atmosphere, which is the air, and the biosphere, which is organisms. Okay. The rate at which carbon is exchanged between these reservoirs depends on the conversion process involved. There's a whole lot of conversion processes I'll leave you to write and read about there. But the problem with these carbon fluxes is it's not possible to directly measure how big these carbon sinks are or how big the flux is between them, so we have to make estimates instead. Okay. We know that the carbon fluxes are very large, so we measure them in something called gigatons. Now, 1 gigaton of carbon equals 1 billion metric tons. That might help a little bit with the conversion ratio there. But because they're large and they're based on measurements from different sources, and we're estimating it, those estimates have large uncertainty levels. And you can see some of the estimates in this diagram here. Okay, last slide, environmental monitoring. So carbon dioxide and methane concentrations in the atmosphere have very important effects. So we need to be monitoring the levels in the environment constantly. Okay, because the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere will affect our photosynthesis rates, as well as the pH of seawater. If we get too high a pH in the seawater, our organisms will die. We lose a large portion of the ecosystem. Okay, both carbon dioxide and methane will influence global temperature, as well as the extent of ice sheets at the different poles, north and south, and indirectly because of that will also affect sea level. Okay, so if the less ice sheets, it's more formed as water, which means there's higher sea level, etc. Through their effects on the amount of heat energy in the oceans, they'll also affect ocean currents, the distribution of rainfall, frequency and severity of extreme weather, so experience more hurricanes. We've also hypothesized that carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere is higher than any time it's ever been in the past 20 million years because of all those fossils that have been stored millions of years ago and we're digging up now and releasing into the environment when they shouldn't be released.